Everybody's voting for the friendly voice of radio, the people's choice. Music, weather, sports, and news, it's radio. The people choose.
Aloha, all you crazy cats out there in Radioland. It's your hostess with the mostest, DJ Dr. John.
And the E Factor.
And we'll be here all night long, playing all the latest, greatest rock and roll hits for you. Just sit back, relax, and get ready for an HM 101 rock and roll party.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Is this thing on? John, were you aware of the fact that in the spirit of good heavy metal podcasts everywhere, we are beginning this particular episode back in the year 1856?
I want to come right out at the beginning of this and just make it clear that I am recording this under protest. While I do not inherently disagree with the implicit concept of this episode, and I do acknowledge that nothing exists in a vacuum, and certainly music progresses in a relatively linear way, and therefore there are influences across time, I think that this is dumb and unnecessary for the subject matter of this podcast, and so everything that I say today is done under objection.
Duly noted. Thank you. You see, John, in order to truly understand the history and development of rock and roll, from the metalhead's perspective, of course, we're going to need to look at a few of the technological innovations that made rock and roll possible. But wait. That's better. We're going to get back to 1856 momentarily. Don't worry. But first, hello, John. How is my good buddy doing this evening?
Well, as you know, Eric, we're in a new year, and it's fucking cold pretty much everywhere as we're recording right now. There's a giant storm blowing across the country. It's sort of miserable.
Ooh. Yeah. I mean, we got snow days in North Carolina. It's definitely the doldrums of winter. Absolutely. So firstly, I wanted to say hi to my beloved co-host. Ding! Mission accomplished. Also, it might be useful if we could tell the listeners a bit more, just a bit more, about what it is we're up to today, since we're dealing with a topic that is somewhat slightly outside of our more traditional heavy metal purview. So, John, could you explain?
I'm going to read this exactly as Eric wrote it, and this is the one sentence that I do not state under objection. Quote, "This is one of those stupid episodes that everyone hates, wherein Eric talks endlessly about a bunch of shit that is clearly and definitely not heavy metal. Woo." End quote.
John, do you worry about the fact that I don't necessarily need your intellectual input anymore and can clearly write absolutely spot-on dialogue for you?
I mean, look, it's pretty great. I'm glad that the level of effort I need to bring to the podcast is just getting lower and lower and lower. That is what I strive for in all of my obligations.
I thought you'd appreciate it. I think that's very sensible. But to put it another way, you might say that this is one of those exceptionally insightful episodes in which we explore the roots underlying heavy metal in ways both illuminating and profoundly entertaining. Woo, indeed. Having previously looked at classical music, the blues, and at some of the foundational female voices crucial to the development of heavy metal, we now turn our attention to arguably the most significant heavy metal roots of them all: old-time rock and roll. You see, John, when it comes down to both the nitty and the gritty, I think most people would agree that heavy metal is, fundamentally, just a subgenre of rock music. Of course, you're not most people, so what do you think? Is heavy metal a subgenre of rock music?
I mean, I think that's probably fair. I think rock music at this point in history is a very generic term that is pretty all-encompassing. So I think putting heavy metal as a subgenre there is not a totally objectionable statement.
With this in mind, I would argue that by understanding the creation and development of rock's earliest iteration, that would be the rock and roll of the 1950s, we are, in fact, helping ourselves to more deeply understand heavy metal itself. Boom! bitches. Boom. So that's what we're going to do. But before we do that, John, could you please remind the people of a few of the ways in which they can support what it is we do here on the Heavy Metal 101 podcast?
Of course, Eric. Were you aware that every time a Heavy Metal 101 listener rates, reviews, or shares this podcast on their social media, an Earth Angel gets their wings?
Ha! Now that's a sly reference to the 1954 hit Earth Angel by the Platters. John, that was very witty and very HM 101 of you.
Thank you. I definitely came up with that joke myself. Also, don't forget that you can reach out to us anytime via email or social media. The links are in the show notes. Lastly, please do consider joining us on Patreon for just $3 a month. You'll get access to both exclusive content and to Eric's undying love and appreciation.
Ain't that the truth? Alrighty then. It is time now to begin our delightful journey through the history of rock and roll, which I am going to be dividing into 3 phases. The first phase I like to call Time Traveling Tech Corner with Eric and John. John, let's go!
Phase 1, Time Traveling Tech Corner with Eric and John.
Great work, buddy. Great work. We begin, for reals this time, as all good heavy metal podcasts should, in the year 1856. Much of the history of music has been driven by technological innovation, and some of the innovations which eventually would allow for the development of rock and roll had their earliest stirrings back in the 19th century. John, could you introduce us to the first of these technological marvels, the microphone?
The earliest innovations towards the development of a functional microphone indeed occurred in the year 1856, courtesy of an Italian inventor, Antonio Meucci, which is why fucking Eric is forcing us to start a fucking heavy metal podcast episode in the fucking 19th century. However, we can quickly fast forward all the way to 1916. When E.C. Wendt developed the earliest condenser microphone, the technology upon which most recording studio microphones thereafter would be based.
Now, in a related development, it was in 1925 that electric recording took over from the acoustic variety. And speaking of electricity, while microphones were pretty important to the evolution of popular music, particularly in forever altering the styles of singing which would be necessary for those singers to be heard over their accompanying musicians, amplification is an area of technological innovation particularly near and dear to the heart of metalheads everywhere. John, tell the listeners what you see in this picture.
I see a giant wall of amps.
18! It's a 3x6 stack. Would you agree that that is the proverbial fuck ton of amplification?
That feels like a lot.
It is a lot. Now, this particular stack of Marshall cabinets was the one that was utilized by the late, great Jeff Hanneman of Slayer. Slayer! Nothing, and I mean nothing, says heavy metal quite like the proverbial fuck ton of amplification. Now, the first amplifiers were available as early as 1912. Early amplifiers would put out a not exactly earth-shattering 5-ish watts of sound, though this would, of course, steadily increase over the decades that followed.
Of course, rock and roll and heavy metal aren't just about volume, but also about the instruments doing the performing. Crucial instrumental innovations included...
Number 1, the electric guitar.
It was in 1932 when Beauchamp, Barth, and Rickenbacker collaborated to create the first electric guitar, which was commercially produced by their Ropat-In Corporation, which was renamed the Rickenbacker Electro-Stringed Instrument Company.
Ooh, catchy.
In 1934.
Important early models of electric guitar included the first Gibson Les Paul guitar, released in 1952, and the first Fender Stratocaster, which debuted in 1954. John, electric guitar is king when it comes to rock and metal. We all know this, but there ain't no heavy metal without the low end possible through the development of an electric amplified bass as well.
That's true. While the earliest stirrings of an electric bass technology also came about in the 1930s, these instruments wouldn't be mass produced until 1951 when Fender released their precision bass.
Golly! We've got singers a-singing into microphones and electric guitars and basses riffing and shredding away. John, what are we still missing from our rock band equation?
Well, early examples of the drum kit date from the 1860s. However, a technique particularly near and dear to the hearts of metalheads, double bass drumming, can be traced to the imaginative fancy of a 15-year-old drummer named Louis Bellson, who first sketched out a double bass drum kit for an assignment for his art class. Bellson would grow up to become a world-class jazz drummer and to innovate double bass drumming techniques starting in 1946, influencing generations of drummers to come.
Fuck yes! Voice, guitar, bass, drums. We've done it! Heavy metal, here we come! But wait. There are just two more technological innovations we still need to discuss before we can leave Time-Traveling Technology Corner with John and Eric. Otherwise, we'll be trapped here forever in a sort of unstable, oscillating purgatory of weird historical sound effects and musical cues. And we wouldn't want that. Okay, John, let's tag team this bitch. Records and distortion. And break!
1877. Fuck you. The first phonograph, come on, was invented by Thomas Edison in the year 1877. But in the 1890s, Emil Berliner developed the technology to transition from Edison's cylinders to flat disc records resembling those we are familiar with today.
Now here's the thing. Record players themselves obviously changed the game, as the ability to play recorded music from the comfort of one's own home forever altered the experience of listening to music. The same could be said of radio, which began to be a meaningful thing in the US in 1920, but the record player had a unique role in the history of rock and roll, as the mechanics of the records themselves would have a hand in shaping the art form.
In 1901, the earliest 78 RPM shellac records were made, becoming the industry standard by 1910. This is important for a few reasons. Number one, 78s held only 3 to 5 minutes per side, which essentially determined the viable length for popular songs thereafter. Number two, 78s didn't sound particularly great, and they didn't last very long. This is important in that by the 1950s, most radio stations had trashed all their old shellac 78s and had moved on to newfangled vinyl records, and to newer music that was being released in that format.
Those vinyl records included 1. 45 RPMs, first released in 1949, and more or less the higher fidelity equivalent of the old 78s, holding approximately 5 minutes of music per side, and number 2, 33 RPMs, which were first released in 1948 and were able to hold a whopping 20 minutes per side, allowing for the development of the album as we know it. Shazam! Okay, all right. Lots of tech. So much tech. We've still got one last tech subject to discuss, but I'd like to deal with distortion just a little bit differently, as its development ties directly into what many people consider to be the very first rock and roll song. As such, let's tell us a little story about a truly awful human being and some of his pals, and then listen to the monumentally important song that they recorded, all by way of learning a bit about both the history of distortion and the birth of rock and roll, of rock and roll, of rock and roll, of rock and roll.
There is no first rock and roll song. The very idea is myth. However, if there was a first rock and roll song, it might just be Rocket 88, which was recorded by Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm, but which was officially credited to Jackie Brenston, Turner's saxophonist, and his Delta Cats.
Now, the story of Rocket 88 takes us to early 1951 and features a number of important historical characters, including Ike Turner's friend, Riley, better known to the world by his stage name, B.B. King, who suggested that in order to record his band, Turner should go see a man named Sam Phillips in Memphis. Ooh, John, footnote me.
Sam Phillips was the founder of Sun Records and Sun Studio, where he produced some of the most important artists in the history of rock and roll, including Roy Orbison, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, and Howlin' Wolf, and where, most importantly of all, he discovered and first recorded a young singer by the name of Elvis Aaron Presley in 1953.
John, this is a nuclear fucking footnote. Excellent work. So, after speaking with Phillips, Ike, along with his band, set off from Mississippi for Memphis in order to do some recording. Legend has it, however, that while en route, they got a flat tire, and that in the process of changing it, the damned guitar amp fell out of the damned car and onto the damned road.
God damn it!
When they finally got to the studio and began to play, the guitar amp sounded odd. The timbre of the guitar played through the amp was now all distorted. Phillips, however, liked the sound, and the recording session went on as planned. The first song recorded was the Jackie Brenston penned Rocket 88. John, was rock and roll born to the happenstance of a flat tire? Could that be so?
I'm going to say no.
It's fair.
This song sounds almost like every other song from around this time period, with the exception of the fact that the guitar just sounds fuzzy. It almost just sounds like badly recorded as opposed to an intentional choice, right?
Much like our good friends Venom, who we'll be talking about in a future episode again. But yes, I know what you're saying. Yes, it does sound sort of happenstance, low fidelity.
So can we potentially point to this as an example of early rock and roll? Sure. Is it the birth of rock and roll? I'm unwilling to concede that.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. I support this viewpoint. I really do. As previously mentioned, calling Rocket 88 the first rock and roll song is kind of silly. Rock and roll had many fathers. It also had a number of mothers. Let us not forget the great sister Rosetta Tharpe, who may have recorded the first rock and roll song as early as 1944. Regardless, Rocket 88 is important, not least for this early use of distortion in guitarist Willie Kizart's performance. Whether or not this was the proverbial first rock and roll song, distorted electric guitar is certainly one of the most important aspects of heavy metal to come. So let's celebrate Jackie, Willie, and all the Delta cats, except for Ike Turner. Fuck Ike Turner. And let's listen to this historically important tune, Rocket 88, recorded by Sam Phillips at Sun Studio, though it was then still known as Memphis Recording Service, in March of 1951. Pause the podcast, friends, click the link, and we will be right back. John! Rocket 88, a Stone classic. Did you enjoy this historical sonic landmark?
I just feel so good now having formally listened to that, just like all the great heavy metal bands have done, and to be able to appreciate their history and know where their music comes from.
You know, Warrior Soul have a song entitled Rocket 88. Boom!
Okay, that's one band that we have previously discussed on this podcast.
No, I'll agree that there is probably a lot of ahistorical music making being made in heavy metal circles, but we take the long view, and we know that songs like this, that moments like the inadvertent distortion, broken down amp that makes a sound not quite like any other, these are important moments in music history. We care about these moments. Don't we care, John?
Sure. I mean, look, it's a fine song. It sounds like every other song from this period of time. Like, there's nothing particularly impressive about it, right? Like, it's fine. It's not a bad song, but it's just sort of, it's good. Let's do the blues, like whoop-de fucking do,
Yeah, it's an amplified electric blues with some distortion. That's what it is, and it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. I'm not here to tell you that it is a brilliant musical masterpiece. It just encapsulates something very important that was happening at this period in music history in one song reasonably effectively. Is that okay? Is that fair? It's like a landmark.
Sure.
Okay, good. You need landmarks, otherwise you get lost. So anyway, enough tech. I feel like fucking Mr. Wizard today. I'm very ready to move us away from the wonderful world of technological innovations, if that's okay with you, John.
I mean, I'm scared to see where we go, but I guess we'll find out.
Hey, you had fun, didn't you? You didn't think that little journey through time and space would be quite so delectable, did you?
The technological part felt like the most relevant thing we could actually talk about, because I can see the relationship between the development of the electric guitar and the creation of heavy metal as a genre.
We're really doing special stuff here today, John. All right. Clearly, for better or worse, it is time for a shiny new phase of our discussion.
Phase 2, proto rock and roll.
John, what the fuck is rock and roll anyhow? Any ideas?
I mean, no clue. Fully no clue. Because, kind of like I said earlier, it feels like such a broad genre of music at this point. I have no idea how a historian would categorize rock and roll.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. You're exactly right. It is definitely an amalgamation of multiple things. They're absolutely true. We'll get there. We'll get there. I swear. Now, we've looked at some of the technological innovations that made rock and roll possible. But in order to truly understand how this music came to be, we need to get some sort of a sense of where it came from. You see, rock and roll, as I've said, is basically just an amalgamation of a variety of pre-existing musical genres. These genres include jump blues, gospel, boogie-woogie, country and western, electric blues, and R&B. That's rhythm and blues to you and me. Fuck. Now that's a lot of stuff getting amalgamated down into one theoretical thing, hence your aforementioned confusion. And I just want to say for the record, I'm absolutely sure that racism has nothing to do with any of the things we'll be discussing, right?
Racism playing a role in something that happened in the United States of America? That seems so preposterous, Eric.
Look, the simple truth is that conventional wisdom in this area, this sort of rock and roll history area and discussion, it's unarguably somewhat problematic when we discuss what is and what supposedly is not rock and roll. But I do think there's value in considering some of the many musical styles that certainly could be called rock and roll, maybe they should, but tend instead to be thought of as proto-rock and roll, for various reasons, up to and including lots of fucking racism. So let's us have a little fireside chat about some of these musics that would eventually be incorporated into rock and roll. All right, John, boogie-woogie. The hell is a boogie-woogie?
Well, I'm so glad you asked me, because as you know, I am an expert. Boogie-woogie was a piano-based variety of the blues that became popular in the 1920s. It was characterized by a distinctive walking bass line in the left hand, which the right hand then played syncopated melodies against. For instance...
Aha! You, as always, are an invaluable fount of information. As I am sure you already know, a boogie-woogie entitled Rollin' Pete, first recorded in December of 1938 by the future R&B legend, singer Big Joe Turner, and also by the pianist Pete Johnson, is considered by many to be one of rock and roll's founding oral documents. I am not going to do an official listening break, but for those who are interested, I am including a link to this seminal recording in the show notes. Okay then. Now, the blues, arguably, is the father of all American popular music, which is why we previously dedicated an entire episode of the Heavy Metal 101 podcast to the subject, which John loved, and is really glad we did. On that episode, we covered some amount of monumentally important proto-rock and roll, including the classic blues of Bessie Smith, the country blues of Robert Johnson, and the electric blues of Muddy Waters. John, do you remember that?
Yeah, 3 artists I knew and like.
Yeah, see? Good stuff. Good stuff. Now, a blues subgenre we did not discuss on that episode, however, which is a critical link between the blues and rock and roll, is the jump blues, a genre pioneered by a fellow named Louis Jordan, who was so hot from the 1930s through 1950s that he became known as the King of the Jukebox. John, I'm curious, if the proverbial they were going to call you the king of something, what do you think that something might be?
Darkness.
Anyhow, jump blues was a particularly fast and dancey music which synthesized blues elements alongside materials taken from the big band swing style that was then in vogue. It is important to note that jump blues groups, like for instance Louis Jordan and his Timpani Five, were generally much smaller than big bands. Now, Jordan was indeed an all-important pioneer, but in the interest of considering the jump blues via a heavy metal history lens, I'd like to introduce our listeners to jump blues via the work of one of Jordan's contemporaries, a fellow by the name of Tiny Bradshaw. Bradshaw, a band leader, singer, composer, pianist, and drummer, first wrote and performed a jump blues number entitled "The Train Kept A-Rollin" in 1951. John, are you familiar with that song?
Why, yes, Eric, I am.
Ah, it's a significant one, right?
I don't know, you made me listen to it.
Oh, are you only familiar with... Well, that doesn't count. Were you... Motherfucker. Were you familiar with this song? Not necessarily this recording, but were you familiar with this song prior to listening to it on the playlist?
I don't think so. I mean, that title doesn't sound totally unfamiliar to me, but in listening to it, again, all their songs just kind of sound the same because they use the same chord progression and have the same fundamental harmonic rhythm.
I get it. We'll talk a little bit about that. That said, we're going to discuss an extremely significant 1956 recording of this very same tune shortly. But it is worth noting now that The Train Kept A-Rolling has long captured the imaginations of some of the harder rocking bands around. In 1965, it was covered by the proto-hard rockers, the Yardbirds. In 1968, Led Zeppelin, the musical descendants of said Yardbirds, were still playing it regularly. In 1974, a young band from Boston, Aerosmith, recorded it for their sophomore album. And in 1977, a band whose heavy metal pedigree cannot be questioned, Motorhead, recorded their own version of The Train Kept A-Rolling as the final track on their self-titled debut. So John, would you now agree that this song appears to have a rather storied history across the early history of heavy music?
Sure. I'd love to hear the Motorhead version of this.
Oh, it's good. I'll send it your way. Don't you worry. Again, no official break, but I am putting a link to Bradshaw's 1951 recording in the episode notes, and I do suggest checking it out. You'll get a sense of what the jump blues was all about, as well as how different the original version is from the 1956 one that we'll look at a little bit more closely soon. Now, we could talk and listen to groovy rock and roll precursors forever, but I know that John is going to get very cranky if we don't make our way into Phase 3, an exploration of actual rock and roll repertoire, soon.
Hey!
Now, I'm not going to devote any time here to country and western or gospel, but I do think that R&B merits at least a brief discussion.
Don't worry, everybody. He's just using that as an excuse to circle back to both of those as separate episodes later.
Would that be so wrong, John? Come on, Hank Williams episode? Anyway, you see, with R&B, we have reached the genre that, for all intents and purposes, was rock and roll. But for the fact that it was played exclusively by black people. And therefore, for some reason or another, racism, it was called something else. You can think of it like this. When a black artist, for instance the aforementioned Big Joe Turner, would record a shit-kicking song, for instance, his February 1954 recording of the Jesse Stone-penned Shake, Rattle, and Roll, that would be called R&B. However, when Bill Haley and his Comets, white dudes, recorded their own distinctly less shit-kicking and audacious version in June of that same year, well, that, my friend, we call rock and roll. John, how do you feel about this distinction?
I think it is indicative of the cultural climate of the 1950s America musical atmosphere that this type of distinction was made. I think it's bullshit, and I am glad, at least musically speaking, we seem to have moved past that.
Nice. Good on you. So, rhythm and blues, a term which also, in 1949, took over as the name for what had been previously known as the race record charts. But R&B was really just rock and roll played by black people. That has since been left out of that canon, primarily by white music historians. Yay! Now, is there any other meaningful musical distinction between early R&B and rock and roll to be made? Yeah, probably. But I'm not going to be the one to make it. And so we're going to move on now. We've got that bit of unpleasantness out of the way. So, John.
Yes?
Phase 3 time. Let's rock and roll.
All you crazy kids out there in podcast land, strap on your dancing shoes. The witching hour has arrived, and it's time for Phase 3, that old-time rock and roll. The etymology of rock and roll.
The earliest origin of the term rock and roll dates all the way back to the 17th century.
Fuck you. Fuck you.
When rocking and rolling was a term used by sailors, both to describe the movement of a ship at sea, very logical, and also describing a similarly rocking and rolling set of movements generally known for taking place in the boudoir. John, you see what they were doing there?
Sure.
Those 17th century sailors were talking about fucking, John. 17th century fucking. Did you get that?
Yeah, okay, everyone fucks. That doesn't make it rock and roll.
17th century sailors are hella rock and roll. Anywho, come the roaring 1920s, rocking and rolling existed in the lexicon as slang both for dancing and sex, but gradually became tame enough such that by the early 50s, it could enter use as the description of a nascent genre of unusually frisky dance music, our beloved rock and roll. Although the term had long been in vogue within the African-American community, it was, of course, a white dude, DJ Alan Freed, who took the credit for coining it as the label for this music. White dudes, John, are the worst. Am I right?
And confirm.
Indeed. But what was that frisky dance music that Freed was talking about? At long last, it is time to talk about the 1950s and the golden age of rock and roll.
The fabulous 50s, a crazy decade when a youth-oriented musical revolution called rock and roll was all the rage. The first rock and roll tune to break through and burn up the Billboard pop charts was Crazy Man Crazy, released by Bill Haley and his Comets in April of 1953.
Now, as previously mentioned, there is no one true definitive first rock and roll song. Rocket 88 is as good a place to start as any, but that Bill Haley and his Comets were the first band to have a pop hit with something fairly universally acknowledged to be a rock and roll song makes for at least another moment worthy of acknowledgement. Messieurs Haley and Co. also need to be acknowledged for having been responsible for truly breaking the whole rock and roll thing big via a little song called Rock Around the Clock. The first rock and roll song to hit number one on both the US and UK pop charts, and as of 2023, still the second best-selling rock single of all time, having moved over 25 million copies. It's pretty crazy. John, are you a Rock Around the Clock fan?
Fan feels like a strong word. Of course, I've heard this song before, and I don't dislike it, but it's not like I'm out there on my daily commute going, man, I gotta turn on Rock Around the Clock.
It's fair. It's fair. You go home and you have a scotch, and that's when you blast the Rock Around the Clock.
That's right. As I'm unwinding at the end of my day, gonna rock around the clock tonight. Well, yeah, fuck you.
I can see you like in the old TDK commercials where the guy's sitting in the armchair and the speakers are blowing his hair back. Now, when I was just a wee young metalhead, delving into metal's roots as part of a middle school project, I actually first came across the popular contention that Rock Around the Clock was the very first true rock and roll song, and that hence Bill Haley was one of the most important forefathers of heavy metal. Nowadays, I'd be inclined to disagree with that assessment, but it still is a great and truly important song / recording, and it is massively culturally significant. Interestingly, Rock Around the Clock, when first released in May of 1954, went relatively unnoticed. It only became a massive hit when it was included on the soundtrack for the film Blackboard Jungle. A few other notes before we listening break this bad boy. Number one, while Haley did write some of his own songs, Crazy Man Crazy, for instance, which is terrible, Rock Around the Clock was written by songwriters Max C. Freedman and James E. Myers. 2. Now say what you will about Bill Haley and his Comets, but anyone who doubts the importance of a quality arrangement / performance should check out the hideous mess of a version recorded earlier in 1954 by Sunny Day and His Knights. Woof. It is terrible. 3. Heavy metal fans should take particular note of guitarist Danny Cedrone's absolute fireball of an electric guitar solo. Shredder!
All right, kiddos, get ready to stay up late as we rock around the clock with Bill Haley and his Comets. Pause the show, click the link, we'll see you on the other side.
John, have you perhaps noticed that just about every old-time rock and roll song seems to be based on a 12-bar blues?
Why, Eric, I have.
I noted that you noticed that. And it is not true. It is true. It is definitely true. Rock Around the Clock is a damn good example of the genre, but look, it's generally fair to say that musical, formal complexity and experimentation were not the order of the day during the early development of rock and roll, which was, it should be noted, first and foremost music that was meant to be danced to. Overly complex music does not lend itself to dance. I think you and I can both agree that that is the case.
Tell that to Stravinsky.
Yes, indeed. Fair enough. The exception that proves the rule, perhaps. Anyhow, Haley was formerly a Western swing musician who, through careful experimentation and emulation, found himself the perfect formula for a rock and roll mega hit. But he was never really a genre innovator. So let's move along to some of the truly great artistic voices in early rock history. Yeah! First, a man predominantly known for 2 things. 1, being arguably the most important creative artist in early rock and roll, and 2, being a genuinely awful excuse for a human being. That's right, folks. It's time to talk about the father of rock and roll, Chuck Berry.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I shall do for you first a song that I first recorded. Number 1, it was a fairly nice hit, and it went quite high in the American charts. The title of it is Maybelline.
May 21st, 1955. Using a purposefully overdriven amplifier to generate a distorted guitar tone, Chuck Berry records his first hit, Maybelline.
Ooh, the old HM 101 timeline mode. Love it! Berry's big break came after meeting the great master of the electric blues, Muddy Waters, who sent the talented younger musician over to see Leonard Chess of Chess Records. It was for Chess that Berry recorded Maybelline, which sold more than 1 million copies and hit number 1 on the Billboard R&B chart. Why R&B, you ask? Because, John, Chuck Berry was a black dude, so therefore R&B. Got it?
Got it.
Great. But Maybelline also crossed over onto the pop charts, getting all the way to number 5 over there. It was a crossover hit. Now, Maybelline was just the first of Berry's many hit singles, but I think it has always been his 1958 classic, Johnny Be Good, that has most captured that metalhead imagination. You see, Johnny Be Good is a rock song all about celebrating rock and living a rock and roll life. And John, you know us metalheads love shit like that, right?
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And we love riffs. And there's hardly a more iconic guitar riff in all of history than that which opens Johnny Be Good. There's also a really rockin' guitar solo. This here is the good shit. So let's take another pause, and we're going to listen to the father of rock and roll doing his thing. Johnny Be Good tonight. Now that's a damn fine song. John, isn't that a damn fine song?
Sure, that's a good song.
Yeah, it's a good one, right? I mean, I think it's probably the best one we've heard so far, right?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Like the aforementioned Maybelline and a whole bunch of other Barry singles, Johnny Be Good was a crossover hit, hitting number 2 on the R&B charts and number 8 on the pop charts. Everybody, it would appear, loves Johnny Be Good. Even the Sex Pistols covered it in 1979. And of course, there are whole generations who were introduced to the song via Marty McFly's performance in the movie Back to the Future. I was one of those people. John, you?
Ooh, I don't know if that's the first time I heard it.
Okay. I mean, you would agree that that was a moment in which a lot of people probably heard the song.
Oh, absolutely.
Barry, while universally regarded as a rock and roll musician par excellence, is not so well regarded otherwise. His list of creepiness, arrests, and general unpleasantness is astoundingly long. But it's particularly worth noting that Barry, like so many of the Golden Age rockers, suffered a major career setback at the very end of the 1950s. He was arrested in 1959 on charges of transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines for unwholesome reasons.
Ooh.
He eventually, appropriately, served prison time, and he was never quite the star he had been in the 1950s. John, shitty people who make fantastic music. Do you have thoughts?
Oh my God. I mean, there's so many in the history of the genre of music that I live in. Look, society moves ever forward, we hope, and we have to reflect and acknowledge who people were. Most of them sucked.
Most of them sucked. I'm pretty sure that if we actually took all of the music out of the repertoire made by shitty people, the world would be worse off for it.
Well, we certainly wouldn't be able to do this episode, and we probably wouldn't be able to do this show.
Yikes! I think you are correct, sir. So let's move along, shall we? Getting into dangerous territory here. Let's move things along to someone actually who's only negligibly less complicated than Barry, but he's a whole lot more fun. John, I have one thing to say to you. A wop bop a loobop, a wop bam boom.
You're not going to do that with more conviction?
A wop bop a loobop, a wop bam boom.
Well, that was more conviction. I don't know if it was more accurate, but it was more conviction.
Woo! I'm dizzy now. I got the vapors. Woo!
It's good to be able to make yourself laugh. That's healthy. September 14th, 1955. Little Richard records Tutti Frutti, providing an excellent early example of the sorts of extreme vocal timbres that would eventually become a cornerstone of heavy metal.
And Tutti Frutti was originally about anal sex. So that's fun, right?
So fun!
Tutti Frutti, good booty. If it don't fit, don't force it. You can grease it. Make it easy. John, those were Little Richard's original lyrics for his perennial fun rock classic, Tutti Frutti. What do you think?
I mean, I knew this. This is not news to me.
You were familiar with this anecdote?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But great. Fantastic. Love it.
Yeah, it's fun. Richard Wayne Penniman, better known to the world as Little Richard, contained multitudes. He was a bisexual black man who spent a not insignificant portion of his early career performing in drag, under the name Princess Lavon, incidentally, and who eventually left popular music to become a preacher who frequently denounced, among other things, homosexuality. Plus, gigantic pompadour. Now, John, I've got to ask, what's your stance on pompadours?
Boy, I mean, I don't think I could pull it off, but I'd love to see him make a comeback.
I mean, you could pull it off a lot better than I could. That's for sure.
I don't know. We get you a wig, just like a full bore pompadour wig, and then like one of those white era Elvis jumpsuits.
Oof, yes.
Could be good.
All right. All right. I like this. Well, I think what we're saying here is we as a podcast are at least willing to consider being pro Pompadour.
Yes, absolutely. Heavy Metal 101 is pro Pompadour.
Excellent.
If you're pompadouring, send us your pictures. Tag us on Instagram.
Please, everybody. We'd love to see it. A discussion of Little Richard affords us the opportunity for another Sister Rosetta Tharpe cameo, as it was that magnificent godmother of rock and roll who gave Richard his start in 1947, after overhearing the then 14-year-old Richard singing one of her songs outside of one of her concerts. She was so impressed that she invited him to open for the concert. Now, following an early career rife with trials, tribulations, and false starts, Little Richard's star at last began to rise with the release of Tutti Frutti, which was lyrically tamed by an assist from songwriter Dorothy LaBostrie, who replaced that original anal sex referencing stanza I read earlier with the following brilliant, incisive lyric. Tutti Frutti, all Rudy. Tutti Frutti, all Rudy. Now, John, this is why we pay the big bucks and bring in the professionals, no?
Well, if we were to pay any amount of money to produce this podcast, certainly the first thing they would do is censor us as well.
You think there would be changes made?
I think there might.
A lot of red ink on the old script page, huh?
Yeah, I probably would have to re-record most of my lines.
Fair. Regardless, the cleaned-up version of the song launched Richard's career and introduced the rock and roll world to some of the more wild and flamboyant performance stylings heretofore seen, helping to establish the template for a zillion outrageous, wild, and crazy rockers to come. John, we simply must have a taste of what all this hubbub sounded like.
That's right, kids. It's time to rock to the east and to rock to the west with everyone's favorite musical madman, Little Richard, and his crazy hit, Tutti Frutti. Pause the podcast, click the link, and get ready to wop-bop-a-loo-bop-a-wop-bam-boom.
Ooh, your version was much better than mine. Less outre and amusing, but much better. There's room for both, I think.
That's right.
That's why this works so well.
You are certainly the fun one on the podcast. We know that.
Oh, I thought that was good. I thought I had fun listening to you. I was very, very impressed. So John, Tutti Frutti, you like?
Great song.
Oh, so good. So good.
Yeah.
Top shelf rock and roll classic. With Chuck Berry and Little Richard, you can pretty much do no wrong. Alas, as seemingly with all of these classic rock and rollers, Richard's time in the sun didn't last much beyond the 1950s. In 1958, following what he described as a sign from God, Little Richard decided, temporarily at least, to stop performing secular music and to repent for his sinful ways. Amen. Now, John, should I worry about that very same thing happening to you?
Seems unlikely.
Okay. So I'm keeping my eye on things, just in case.
You do you. I wouldn't worry.
Okay. That makes me feel better. I think the world would have been a better place if Little Richard hadn't moved on so soon. Same thing I would say about you. Amen. If you become a homophobic preacher, I think the world will be a less good place.
I think that's probably true, but I bet I'll make more money.
I won't refute that. All right, it's time to be moving on, because there's an elephant with us in this room. A creature so massive, so powerful, so awe-inspiringly huge, that it can no longer be ignored. John, do you perhaps know the name of this elephantine cultural force who stands before us? Rhinestones a-gleaming.
Well, if we're talking 1950s and rhinestones, we can only be talking about one person.
Elvis Aaron Presley.
January 27th, 1956, Elvis Presley's major label debut single, Heartbreak Hotel, is released, and the first true rock star is born.
The King, John, has entered the building. So I'm curious, what do you think about Elvis?
Elvis is a weird one. I don't know if this was just my upbringing or if it's just growing up in America, but like everybody knows about Elvis, like is just a ubiquitous cultural figure for some good reasons and some less good reasons. But generally speaking, I like Elvis's music.
Yeah, Elvis is definitely complicated. I've never had like a really intimate musical relationship with Elvis, but the more Elvis that I listen to, the more I sort of explore. I get it. Like tremendous charisma, tremendous interpretive ability within his, somewhat narrow but very specific framework. Yeah, yeah, I like Elvis. In the context of what we've already discussed, which is rock and roll's very problematic racial history, I think it's very easy to dismiss Elvis. He was a performer, not a songwriter, unlike Little Richard and Chuck Berry. And a lot of people might see him as just the most successful of the many attempts that have been made to whitewash early rock and roll history. The truth, however, I think, is considerably more complicated. Much of the music making Elvis was doing during the 1950s is, I think, objectively really good. It's very good. I have some quibbles with some of the things he made later in life, but in his heyday, Elvis was an excellent musician. I would argue that his principal contribution to rock and certainly heavy metal history was probably cultural rather than musical, in that he brought danger, sex appeal, and swagger to the larger rock and roll universe, and these are, of course, all essential attributes of heavy metal to come.
Yes, indeed.
The most compelling music making of his career, I think, took place in the early days on the indie rockabilly recordings produced by Sam Phillips at Sun Records in Memphis. But it was upon moving to the major label RCA that his career did go supernova. Heartbreak Hotel hit #1 on the pop charts, #1 on the country and western charts, and #5 on the R&B charts. In other words, everybody was listening to this music. Heartbreak Hotel by itself sold over 1 million copies, but it's worth noting that in his first year on RCA, Elvis's singles collectively sold over 10 million copies, which is pretty good in a single year, right?
That's wild.
Yeah, it's a lot of singles. We can't talk Elvis without mentioning the iconic cultural moment that was his televised appearance on the legendary Ed Sullivan Show. However, by way of clarification, I should note that Elvis was actually on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 times between September of 1956 and January of 1957. The first of those performances, on September 9th, 1956, was viewed by an estimated 60 million people.
Oh, wow.
And more or less changed the entire world forever. He played 2 brief sets. The first consisted of Don't Be Cruel and the ballad Love Me Tender. It was pretty tame. But in the second set, Elvis the rock star was on full display, performing the Little Richard song Ready Teddy, and concluding with 2 raucous choruses of Hound Dog. So, let's us take a little video break. We're going to take a video break and look in on what that final set on September 9th, 1956 looked and sounded like. And we're going to see if we can't get ourselves a bit of a feel for what that Elvis phenomenon must have felt like way back in September of 1956. You know, John, as a great philosopher once said, Elvis was pretty fucking cool, no?
Yes, Nietzsche.
He was a big Elvis fan. A lot of people don't know that. I'm glad that you do. In yet another example of God's vengeful smiting of rock culture at the end of the 1950s, Elvis was drafted into the Army at the end of 1957 and began his service in March of 1958. He would be off to West Germany by the end of that year. And while Elvis, of course, never did cease to be a monumental cultural icon, his career was honestly never the same after the 1950s. But John, I don't know if you know this, but we here at Heavy Metal 101 are, in fact, a heavy metal podcast. Were you aware of that?
Some might disagree.
I've heard counter-arguments, but it's true. And while I do think a straight line can be drawn from the birth of rock and roll to the birth of heavy metal 2 decades later, I'd like to spend at least a tiny bit of time today attempting to tie these 2 threads together just a bit more tightly. So, John, I'd like to tell you about how there are some people, some very smart people, who have suggested that the very first heavy metal song was released in September of 1956. John, what do you have to say about that?
I'm so not convinced that these people aren't just you.
That's fair. Me with like a fake mustache. Now, just like with rock and roll, it is nearly impossible to identify any one true first heavy metal song. However, the author Martin Popoff has, audaciously, and perhaps a little bit cheekily, suggested that one good candidate was the recording of A Train Kept A-Rollin', recorded on July 2nd, 1956 by Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio. Crazy, man. Crazy. John, this recording was on your playlist. Do you think that there is any whiff of validity in Popoff's supposition?
I don't know. I mean, I can hear how this is not like the other version of The Train Kept A-Rollin' that we heard on this very same podcast.
Okay, well, for the record, here is how Popoff described this recording. Quote, electric guitar licks, chugging machine gun propulsion, a driving 4/4 beat kept bluesy only by the walking bass line, distortion, menace, histrionic vocals to the point of tortured screams, reverb on the vocals. It ends with a prescient power chord. Ooh, a powerful case.
That's generous.
I mean, I'm not totally convinced either, but let's all take a listen for ourselves and see if we have indeed found the historic, mythical, first heavy metal song. Pause the podcast, click the link, take a listen. And afterwards, why don't you shoot off an email or find us on social media and let us know. Is this 1956 recording the first heavy metal song? If not, then what is? We look forward to hearing your thoughts. I get it. It's all there. Whether or not one chooses to perceive this as a preposterously early example of proto-heavy metal or not, this 1956 recording profoundly influenced the heavy music that was to follow. John, we previously mentioned some of the many later hard-rocking versions of this song, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Motorhead. I think you'll at least agree that this recording clearly spoke to a lot of people who like to play loud and aggressive music in the years that followed. No?
Look, all I'm saying is fuck you, Martin Popoff.
That's all you have to say.
That's all I have to say on this matter. Let's move on.
Martin, if you'd like to send us an email or perhaps a retort of some kind, that would be great. We'd love to hear from you. So, as if the 1956 version of Train Kept A-Rollin' wasn't enough, we've got more proto-metal via the March 31, 1958 release of Rumble. An instrumental by Link Wray and his Raymen, famous for its use of the power chord, distortion, and feedback. Now, this was an instrumental so raw and fearsome that it was banned by some radio stations. John, would you agree that getting an instrumental song censored is something of an impressive musical feat?
Honestly, yeah. And I'll say this is, like, in listening to this playlist that you made for me, this was actually the track that stood out the most to me as, like, sounding distinctly different from everything else.
Yeah, I agree. It's very different. It's very much pointing the way, I think, to the 60s and to the advent of hard rock and stuff like that. Now, Ray's aggressive use of distortion and tremolo guitar effects were indeed so audacious that the song was banned by radio stations in New York and Boston for fear that it would incite the youth of the day to rumble. So if you've never heard it, I think Rumble might be a bit of an eye-opener. 50s American culture wasn't always all Leave It to Beaver and I Like Ike. Heavy metal darkness was a simmering underneath the surface. So Dr. John, play us a cool tune, would ya?
I don't want to say this next line.
You don't want to call me E-Factor, do you?
I don't. I'd love to, E-Factor. Listener, pause the show, grab yourself a lead pipe, click the link, and get ready to rumble!
Now, dear listener, please do listen to this track. It cost John a small piece of his soul to refer to me as E-Factor, and we should honor that sacrifice by listening to Link Ray and his Raymen.
Also, this is like the most distinctive track from this playlist, so check it out.
Ooh, an endorsement. Yeah! We've already heard a number of reasons why the golden age of rock and roll didn't survive past the 1950s, but no single event more clearly defined the end of that era than the day the music died. February 3, 1959, when Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, better known as the Big Bopper, were killed in a charter plane crash while traveling between gigs from Iowa to Minnesota. Before dealing with that tragedy, however, let's backtrack a little bit, because I think that the life, times, and eventual death of my single favorite 1950s rock and roll icon, Buddy Holly, will be as good a place as any to wrap up this metalhead's history of rock and roll. John, is that okay with you?
Do we need to go through all of Buddy Holly's life? Is that necessary for this? Is that pertinent to the history of heavy metal? Or do you just like Buddy Holly?
All right, read your damn part.
Eric's Tale opens on September 7th, 1936, with the birth of Charles Hardin, a.k.a. Buddy Holly, in Lubbock, Texas. Holly began his instrumental studies at the piano, but eventually switched over to guitar. His earliest musical influence was the country music of the day, but he eventually also took an increasing interest in the R&B, which was growing ever more popular in the early 1950s. As such, when he decided to pursue a career in music, it was via a synthesis of country and western and R&B influences.
John, what would you call a musical commingling of country and western and R&B influences circa 1955?
The setup for lots of hatred.
I would call it rock and motherfucking roll, baby. Sorry, this is a great story. You're doing an excellent job. Please continue.
In the earliest portion of his career, Holly put together a trio, Buddy and the Two-Tones, and managed to secure gigs opening for both Elvis and Bill Haley and the Comets. He was signed to Decca Records in February of 1956. However, his recordings for Decca never managed to take off, and he was dropped by the label in January of 1957.
Well, this is just a fucking bummer. Following a promising start, everything seems to have gone to shit rather quickly. Sigh.
Not only was Holly dropped by Decca, but the nature of his separation with the label left his nascent career in limbo, as he was forbidden from re-recording any of the material he recorded for Decca for 5 years. To avoid any potential legal difficulties, he assembled a new band without his name at the top, the Crickets, which included Holly on lead guitar and vocals, Jerry Allison, drums, Joe B. Maudlin, bass, and Nicky Sullivan, rhythm guitar.
Fun fact alert! One of the earlier names under consideration for the band was the Beatles. John, were you aware of this?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's fun. Anyhow, the Crickets' career did indeed begin with a song that had been recorded for, but never released by, Decca. That'll Be the Day. Now, John, I can only assume that you already knew and loved That'll Be the Day before hearing it on your playlist.
How weird would it be if I told you I'd never heard that song before?
I mean, you've said some weird things to me in the past. I don't think it would be at the top of that list, but it would be in the upper echelons, yes. It's a good song, right?
Yeah.
Have we established this? Do you like Buddy Holly?
I don't really know Buddy Holly.
Oh.
I mean, I know that song. I probably know some others, but I haven't done an extensive listening of his oeuvre.
Wow. Well, for the record, the iteration recorded by the Crickets is much better than the earlier one, though these days both versions are publicly available, so you can hear it by quote-unquote Buddy Holly, and you can hear it by the Crickets. Regardless, the Crickets version of That'll Be the Day, released in July of 1957, became a massive hit, going to number 1 on both the US and UK pop charts, and selling over 1 million copies in the US alone. Let's have ourselves one final listening break before we close things out on the other side. Peoples, you know the drill. Do the thing, and John and I will be back for the conclusion of this epic historical exploration on the other side. But first, let's rock and roll, 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 roll. A preposterous quantity of great tunes followed in short order, including Peggy Sue, Every Day, Oh Boy, Not Fade Away, etc., etc. So many great songs. But there should have been more. John, finish the story. You have earned the right.
1958 was a bustling year of touring, television performances, recording, and Holly's secret marriage to Maria Elena Santiago. But it concluded more darkly, with Holly and the rest of the Crickets splitting up, primarily due to the machinations of their unscrupulous dickhead of a manager by the end of that year. 1959 began with Holly assembling a new band and, in order to earn money after having been thoroughly financially fucked by said bastard manager, joining a package concert tour. The Winter Dance Party was going to cover 24 Midwestern cities on consecutive dates and featured other popular artists, including Ritchie Valens of La Bamba and Donna fame, as well as the Big Bopper, aka J.P. Richardson, and Dion and the Belmonts. The tour began on January 23, 1959, and was an absolute clusterfuck from the very start. The booking organization hadn't adequately considered the travel distances required between each stop, and all the musicians on the tour were crowded together onto one frequently malfunctioning bus. Monday, February 2nd, was the 11th consecutive day of constant travel and daily gigs. The bands had just been driven 350 miles from the previous day's performance. The gig that was scheduled for February 3rd was yet another 365 miles away. Stinky, tired, and already at the end of his rope, rather than get back onto the bus, Buddy Holly chartered a small plane for himself and his band. However, J.P. Richardson had come down with the flu, and so he took a seat that had been intended for Holly's new bassist, future outlaw country icon, Waylon Jennings. Ritchie Valens and Holly's guitarist, Tommy Alsop, then flipped a coin for the final seat. Valens won the seat. The plane took off from the airport in Mason City, Iowa at 12:55 a.m. It was out of sight moments later. The pilot failed to check in, as had been expected, at 1 a.m. All further attempts to communicate with the plane thereafter failed. The next morning, the aircraft's wreckage was discovered just 6 miles northwest of Mason City Airport. There were no survivors.
That's a sad story, huh?
That's a very sad story.
Yeah, I mean, and the worst part is, even though obviously a plane crash is a tragic accident, I mean, this really is like human error and monstrous greed and the sort of ridiculous things that musicians then and now are put through in order to share their art and make money and all that stuff. I mean, it's really just very, very depressing. I'm depressed now, John. I'm angry and depressed.
Try the bop bop loo bop.
A wop bop a loop bop a wop bamboo. I feel better now.
Yeah, it worked.
Yeah, it's good.
It worked.
It's good. Little Richard always gets me. That's good. All right. So all that having been said, the music didn't really die that day. The end of the 1950s just marked the end of rock and roll's first phase. But the story of the 1960s, including the birth of hard rock and the tale of proto-metal, well, John, I think that's going to have to wait for another time. Are you okay with that?
Surely we have already talked about this.
There's so much more to talk about.
I'm pretty sure we've talked about this.
I mean, a little bit.
I don't remember most of what we've talked about, but I'm pretty sure we've talked about that.
We'll look back. We'll check out some of the earlier episodes, and we'll decide. We'll see what we still need to cover in the 1960s. We'll have a powwow about it. It'll be nice. Regardless, this is all just something to look forward to. That said, I suppose it's about time for us to be moseying along. So, John, did we have a rockin' good time today, or what?
You know who's going to have a rockin' good time?
Huh.
You trying to edit this 2-hour fucking episode down to a reasonable length.
It's going to be so fun. Look, I know that I had fun today, and just sharing that with you, my friend, that's one of my life's little pleasures. And sharing it with all of you folks out there in podcast land as well. I am one lucky dude. So thanks so much for joining us on this little adventure. Until next time, I offer the following moving words of Bernie Taupin, taken from the #1 best-selling single in the history of rock music. Goodbye, England's rose. May you ever grow in our hearts. You were the grace that placed itself where lives were torn apart. You called out to our country, and you whispered to those in pain. Now you belong to heaven, and the stars spell out your name.
Ending this episode with a bizarre-ass English quote after talking about American rock and roll for 2 hours feels fucking strange, my guy.
We talked about the #2 hit in the history of rock and roll, and now this is the #1 hit.
I think you were really, really begging a lot of your audience to follow that particular train of logic.
You want me to quote "See you later, alligator," don't you? I already did that. I can't do that again. I can't do it.
I want you to quote Milli Vanilli, Eric.
Oh. Girl, you know it's true. And out. Good. Does that tie the threads together better?
Perfectly.